It's UofL Today on 93.9 The Ville. Here's your host, Mark Hebert.
And welcome to UofL Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Ville. For those of you who listen to us on Monday and Tuesday nights on 93.9, you know this is the show about all the great stuff going on at the University of Louisville. The programming, the research, the students, and what they're doing. And so hopefully stick around for the next half hour or so and learn something. On the show today, you may have heard of Delirium. Americans and Europeans spent $350 billion on Delirium each year, but it's often misdiagnosed. And the new dean of UofL School of Nursing will be here to talk about her research on Delirium in a Better Health Together segment, sponsored by our partners at Passport Health Plan. And how did smallpox and other epidemics play a role in the migration and depopulation of Native American tribes in the American Midwest? We'll talk to an anthropologist and expert from SMU who visited UofL a couple of months ago. But first, there's probably someone you know who's waiting for a lung transplant, but there's apparently not a great system to match donors and recipients with the limited number of lungs available. Dr. Matt Fox is a cardiothoracic surgeon, and Dr. Jaimin Trivedi is an assistant professor of cardiothoracic surgery at the University of Louisville, and they've done some research on lung transplants. Welcome, gentlemen. Good to see you.
Thanks for having us.
And it's Jaimin, right?
Yes.
Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah,
All right.
that's
We
right.
want to pronounce the names correctly. That's part of the deal on radio. All right, so you guys have done some research on lung transplants. Well, first of all, Matt, you do lung transplants, right?
That's correct.
All right, so you cut people open.
Every once in a while I do,
Every
yeah.
once in a while you do. All right, so let's talk about just lung transplants in general. How many of them happen at U of L Hospital or Jewish or wherever you do them, and how many do you do per year, and how many are there in the United States per year?
Sure, it's still a relatively rare procedure. In the United States, we do about 2,500 lung transplants a year. When you consider everybody, or the burden of lung disease, it's the number 3 killer in the United States. It's really not that many. For instance, you take the number 1 indication for transplant in adults, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, and there's about 30,000 people with that diagnosed a year, and lung transplant's really the most effective and arguably the only life-sustaining treatment. And if you take 2,500 transplants a year, you can kind of see the disparity. So a big focus on our research is trying to make better utilization of donor lungs to try to get more people transplanted. At Jewish Hospital, we do about 15 to 20 a year. We're probably a mid to low volume program. Our outcomes are excellent, but given the relatively low population size of Kentucky and the fact that we have another transplant center in the state that we won't talk about who also does good work, we're pretty satisfied with our program size, but we're also looking to grow.
Okay, but we're not doing a lot of them here, but 2,500 across the United States. But are there enough lungs out there, Jaimin, in the United States to fulfill the need for all the folks that need lung transplants, or even close?
So typically, there are more donors, but not all the lungs are harvested from those donors for transplant, and they are not taken for various reasons. They have other comorbid conditions or other history that exclude them from being
So they're just
used
not
for
healthy enough to donate the lung. Right?
That's correct. Most organ donors in the United States meet the definition of brain death, where you have no brainstem reflexes, no blood flow to the brain, and it's pretty actually hard to become brain dead. A lot of these patients have massive head trauma, massive strokes. There's no way they can recover. And it is a very strict definition. And when people undergo brain death, there's a lot of bad things that happen, a lot of hormone releases that damage the lungs. When these patients are cared for, they often receive a lot of fluid. That damages the lungs. They often aspirate, and that damages the lungs as well. So if you look at all organ donors, we only take lungs from probably about 10 to 20% of them.
Gotcha. Again, we're talking with Dr. Matt Fox and Dr. Jaimin Trivedi. They're both from U of L and cardiothoracic surgery department. So is there a donor list like there are for hearts and for other things of people that are waiting for donations out there? Is that how it works?
Sure, that's correct.
All right, so there's a list that says 10,000 people are waiting for a donor lung, and then you have to figure out how to match those up with people that are donors. But according to your research, there isn't really any good way to do that right now. Is that right?
So the recipient the list of recipients is actually based on their risk profile. So there is a separate risk profile for who are on the waiting list to receive the lungs, but there is no risk profile done in effective way for donors. So you know which are high risk recipients, but you don't know which are high risk donors. So our research focused on to identify high or low risk donors so that we can match them to sort of be more effective in utilization of all the organs available.
So who's a high risk recipient? I mean, and do those folks they get bumped up to the top of the list, or are they on the bottom of the list because they're high risk?
So I'll have Matt answer that question because he would be more appropriate.
Because he's doing the surgeries, right?
Sure. So when you get listed for a lung transplant, you receive something called a lung allocation score, and it's a calculated score based on a large number of variables, and those change kind of year to year just based on the statistics. And it's kind of arbitrary number from 1 to 100. It's scaled, and it includes some aspect of if you don't get a lung transplant tomorrow, what is your likelihood of dying? And then also, if you do get a lung transplant, is that going to increase your expected survival? And if you got a score of 100, that would mean if you get a lung transplant tomorrow, you're going to live forever. And if you get a score of 1, then we're probably doing you a disservice doing a transplant on you. And most people are listed in the 30s and 40s. And when you get up above a score of 50 to 80, those people tend to be pretty ill, and they actually tend to have a much rougher postoperative course. And what we do know from past studies is that those patients do better when they get better lungs, or at least we have
that
an
makes
idea.
sense.
Yeah. And what we found in this study is that as long as you put good lungs in those patients, they do fine. And if you have a low risk patient, you can put not so good lungs in those patients, and they do fine as well, about equivalent. And that would be potentially matching donors to recipients based on the risk profile would be one way to improve overall lung utilization and kind of global outcomes.
So we're talking again with Matt Fox and Dr. Jaimin Trivedi from the University of Louisville. We're talking about lung transplants and some research they did on who should be on the donor list and the ranking of donors and the ranking of recipients, right? Is that a fair assessment?
Yes. Yeah.
So let me get this straight. I think what you're saying is we don't necessarily want to, if we had a better scoring system for the people that are donating the lungs and a way to rate them better, we could figure out that we could do a more efficient job and a better job of matching folks who need the lungs with the folks who have them to donate, where we wouldn't necessarily be putting a really good lung in someone that may not live for another year, and vice versa, right?
Yeah. That would be, one of the theoretical outcomes of this paper. And if you look at it now, the way we do it, it's all kind of economic. So the lungs get offered to people in order of their lung allocation score in a 250-mile radius from the donor hospital. So the patients that were compatible from a size and blood type, they get offered the organs from highest lung allocation score to lowest lung allocation score. So from sickest recipient to least sick recipient. And so the idea now is that the sick recipients get first shot at the better lungs. And that does work to some degree, but there is also a little bit of disparity there as well.
So Dr. Jaimin Trivedi, what would you tell folks out of this research that you guys did? What's the bottom line that surgeons and lung transplant donors and recipients can learn from your research on this?
So one of the central message of this paper is that, when a donor lung becomes available for transplant, you can, do some objective scoring. And based on the scoring, you can match that lung to a risk profile of the recipient. And you can sort of know what would be potentially their 1 and 5 year survival. And based on that, you can offer that particular organ to a patient who is appropriately matching. And then that way, you are using the organ to the best of the organ's ability to survive.
Do you think there's any chance that there will be a nationwide effort to put this scoring system into place?
That would be a complex.
I know it ain't easy, but I'm just asking.
Yeah.
I mean, you guys did the research.
Currently, that would be a long way off.
That'd be a long way.
So there's larger discussions, and
so it should be done. It just isn't getting to.
Yeah, and I would say our scoring system is rough enough that
Right.
the scoring system we develop isn't ready for prime time in that regard yet.
Right.
But it's an idea to move in that direction.
Okay. All right. Dr. Jaimin Trivedi and Dr. Matt Fox, appreciate you being on the show. All right. You may get a little dizzy from time to time, but how do you know if it's just a phase or the onset of something a little more serious, like delirium? Sonya Hardin is the new dean of the School of Nursing at UofL and has done some research on delirium. Sonya, good to see you.
Thank you.
All right. What is delirium?
Well, it can happen typically to older adults, and it can happen if you're in your own home, if you're in a long-term care setting, or if you're in the hospital. And there is hyperactive and there's hypoactive.
What's the difference?
What's the difference? Well, hyperactive, typically these individuals are very fidgety. They lack the ability to focus. They have inattention to you. It's a very sudden onset that happens where they have disorganized thinking, and they're just not able to integrate their thought process. Now, the hypoactive, a lot of times these individuals are kind of drowsy, and you just think, oh, well, they're just resting, they're just sleeping. But really and truly, they're sick. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of underlying causes of delirium, and I hope we can talk a little bit about those today.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about it here in just a second. So how do I know if I'm an older adult and I start feeling dizzy or I just can't focus or something? How do I know whether I might have delirium or something else?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, typically what I've seen happen if you're living in the home is someone will come by to visit and they'll think, oh, they're just not quite right today. Something is off. And maybe they've had a urinary tract infection that they're fighting, or even been placed on new medications.
And that can trigger it.
It can.
Huh. So is it a dizziness or just you're blanking on stuff? You just can't put thoughts together
You can't.
generally?
Yes, and you just lack attention. You're not focused. You really have an altered mental status with confusion.
Okay. So you talked about if you have an infection or something, what are some of the other things that could trigger delirium? Is it you're delirious, right? But it's
Right.
delirium.
Yes.
What you get. Okay.
That's correct. That's
Okay.
correct. Well, we see it with a variety of different infections and sometimes different medical illnesses. If your electrolytes are abnormal, if you're dehydrated, we see it a lot of times with alcohol and drug withdrawal in the hospital, quite a bit of that. Uncontrolled pain. Now, you wouldn't think that, but not having your pain under control can certainly trigger the delirium. Sleep deprivation.
So it sounds like just about anything.
There's a lot of
could
different
trigger
things.
this.
And we see it mainly with individuals that are 70 plus.
Okay. Well, I'm
Mm-hmm.
not quite there yet, so I'm not too. So I shouldn't have to worry about it quite yet. And again, we're talking with Sonya Hardin, who's the UofL School of Nursing dean, and she's done some background and some research on delirium. How can it be prevented? How do I stop if I'm over 70? How do I stop myself from getting delirium?
Well, you got to really look for any sign that you might have an infection. You need to tell someone that you have started on new medications. So as soon as you get back from the pharmacy, pick up the phone, call someone, let them know that you're starting on a new medication, and ask them to give you a call back in 6 or 8 hours to see how you're doing. Also, I think getting good sleep, not depriving individuals of sleep. In the hospital, we try very hard to block out large segment of time so individuals can get rest. Individuals that are dehydrated, we give them fluid through the IV. And we also know that individuals that have sensory deficits, now this is individuals that wear glasses or hearing aids, are also more prone to delirium while they're in the hospital. So it's very important that we make sure they have their hearing aid and they have their glasses so that they can be fully tuned into us when we're taking care of them. One of the best strategies is early mobilization, and that means when you're in the hospital, We want to get you up and get you moving.
Right. Again, this segment's called Better Health Together, sponsored by UofL's partners at Passport Health Plan, the nonprofit community-based managed care organization that's been administering Medicaid benefits in Kentucky for more than 20 years, and their goal is to improve the health and quality of life for its members. We're talking with Sonya Hardin, the dean of the UofL School of Nursing. We're talking about delirium. And you did some research on how to spot delirium. Is there a better way for doctors to figure out, that person's got delirium? So what was your research?
So I've been looking at delirium for probably the last 2 or 3 years. And we have a number of different instruments out there that we use currently in the hospital. It's kind of like a little checkoff sheet. But more importantly, the latest research that I'm involved in is using a device called Cerebellum, which is goes around the top of your head.
Like a headband?
Like a headband. And it does an EEG. So we're able to see the brain waves of an individual, which we know now that there's alterations in those brain waves if you have delirium. We're hoping that we can identify early on abnormal brain waves before you start even exhibiting symptoms so that we can intervene earlier. Right now, we are getting ready to start enrolling subjects in a study that will let us collect a whole lot of data on brain waves, and we're going to be doing this in a critical care unit so that we have a better chance of capturing it. About 70% of the people who are over the age of 70 in an intensive care unit or critical care unit will develop delirium. So
how much? What percentage? 70?
Up to 70%, yes, will develop delirium. And it's a pretty high percentage.
That's a really high percentage.
And you're taking older adults out of an environment that they're very familiar of being within. Layered on top of that, they have a medical illness. Many of them have an infection to be inside the intensive care unit. So we do see quite a bit of delirium.
And is this, I think you call it Cerebellum, is that what it's called?
Yes.
This device that goes around your head. Is it any better than, in your mind, than what's being done right now?
I think so right now.
Or is that the research to figure out if it is or it isn't?
Yeah, it is the research. I mean, right now, nurses will come into a patient's room. They will assess them and use this checkoff sheet. And so that's just that one moment in time. And then the nurse may come back 4 hours later, 8 hours later, and reassess them. Whereby, if they're wearing this device, we're hoping that it will be continuously reading the brain waves, and we will be able to know much sooner if there's a change in status.
All right, to try and wrap up this discussion on delirium, there are a lot of folks, my age, who have older parents who deal with them from time to time. What would you tell folks like us, like our age, about their older parents and what they should be looking for to see if perhaps they have delirium? Or, I think if I saw that behavior by my parent, I would think, oh, they're getting dementia, it's Alzheimer's or something like that, where it may not be. So how do you know? What do you tell these folks?
Right. So with dementia, that's a slow progression of memory loss and forgetfulness. But with this, it's a very sudden onset. So if you talk to your mom or dad yesterday and they were clear as they could be in the discussion with you, and now today all of a sudden you see some confusion, it could be delirium. It could also be a lot of other things, like a TIA, precursor to a stroke, but they definitely need to be examined.
Real quickly. Okay,
yes.
Good deal. All right, Sonya Hardin, appreciate you being on the show. Well, we often have great speakers and great guests from around the world at the University of Louisville. When guest speakers come on campus, I always try to get them to come on for an interview with me. And with me today is Kacy Hollenback. She's an archaeology professor at SMU, Southern Methodist University down in Texas. But that's not where she spends a lot of her time. She spends it in the Northern Plains with Indians and looking at the different things that are going on in that neck of the woods. So first of all, welcome to the University of Louisville.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
All right. You're an archaeology professor. What do you teach? Archaeology, right?
I teach archaeology.
I
I teach several classes. I teach the Intro to Archaeology. It's called The Science of Our Past. It's it's a big course. Well, it's a big course at a private institution. So, like, they capped at 100 people.
That's not a big course for those of us at the University of Louisville.
But it's a lab class, so it's very hands-on. Kids get to work with artifacts. We do citizen science projects, so they work with real collections to generate online exhibits. But then I teach a wide range of other classes, like I teach North American Indians, which is actually about contemporary issues in Native North America. I teach the anthropology of disaster.
And that's what we're going to talk about.
That is what we're going to talk about.
Okay. All right. Kacy is here at the University of Louisville as a guest of the Departments of History and Archaeology, or Anthropology, here at the University of Louisville. And she is scheduled to talk about just those things that you just mentioned, which is hazards and disaster. You do research on those.
I do.
As an archaeologist. So you're going to have to explain that one.
So most people, we experience disasters like almost weekly, right? You can't turn on the news without seeing something.
Tornadoes,
floods, forest fires. The thing is, those things aren't actually disasters, if you think about it. Hurricanes, forest fires are actually natural processes. They can be totally healthy parts of those ecosystems. And so disasters are inherently social. People have to be a part of them. And so things that can potentially harm people, whether it be human life or human property, those are called hazards. And when they actually do cause damage to those and result in what we call collective stress or collective trauma, something like Hurricane Katrina or any, like the other things that have happened recently.
Tornadoes,
for
floods.
example. Then those are disasters. And the reason they're disasters is because they affect social systems.
Right. But you look particularly at these Indian tribes that were around and when? What time frame are we looking at? And what happened to them as far as epidemics and those kinds of things?
17 and 1800s. And the reason I do that is I started going up to that. I wasn't a plains person. I wasn't a northern plains person.
We're talking northern plains. We're talking about.
We're talking about the Dakotas, Montana, southern Canada. I actually started going up there on accident. I got hired on a project by the National Park Service to do interviews, because sometimes I do ethnographic interviews, but we go out to sites and we say, what happened here. And so I went up and I started working with the Crow. We were working with the Mandan, the Hidatsa, and the Arikara.
And those are all Native American tribes.
They're all Native American tribes, the Sioux. And we tend to think of plains tribes mounted on horseback, war bonnet, living in teepees, but that's not all the tribes were nomadic. There were huge villages up there of sedentary agricultural groups who also hunted bison, groups like the Arikara, Mandan, Hidatsa. And they were trade hubs in this massive indigenous trade network that you would get shells from the Pacific coast, you would get seashells from the Gulf, you would get stone tools, you would get native copper from the Great Lakes area. And all of these things are showing up, and the groups are coming in, and they're quite cosmopolitan.
So they were the UPS hub of their day.
They were more like the Venice or the London or the Boston.
Okay. But a marketing hub.
Yeah, exactly. And so when Europeans come in, they actually are drawn to these places because they want to tap into these trade networks for, say, fur trade. Originally, it's furs from animals for fashion and things like that. But then with the Industrial Revolution, they want bison robes because the belts on the machines are made out of leather. And so bison robes are one way that you can do that. And so Lewis and Clark, when they come through in 1803 and 1804, they remark on how important these places are. But with these Europeans come the diseases. And the reason, so I went up there on accident and I fell in love with the place, but what I noticed when I was doing these interviews with living people today on the reservations is they kept talking about this period of time, and they kept talking about epidemics.
The 1800s?
In the 1700s, and I was like, why are they still talking about things that happened several hundred years ago? And what I'm finding, and you can even look today, disasters aren't events. They're processes. And so if you go to New Orleans, Katrina isn't over. They're still dealing with it, and we're 15, 20 years out or whatever. And so I'm interested in the long-term legacies of disaster and the way that we can better understand how populations can recover and recover quickly is to go back to the past.
Talking with Kacy Hollenback, who's an archaeology professor at SMU and is on campus at the University of Louisville, making a speech and making a presentation. And so what were the disasters then that hit those tribes in the 1700s and 1800s, or the epidemics, and what was the fallout from them? What can we learn from them?
So the fallout is, so the epidemics launched this disaster process. And I actually would say that it launched a series of what I would call convergent catastrophes. And so the main thing was is the number of people that died. Smallpox, and there were other diseases too. You would get pertussis, which is whooping cough, which is terrible, especially for babies. It kills it kills lots of young kids, and so that in and of itself. So you would have smallpox, and then you would have pertussis, and then you might have a cholera epidemic, and then you would have another smallpox epidemic. And as, say, steamboats start coming up, you're getting these things more rapidly. And so depopulation, the loss of life, is a big thing. And if you think about it, if you have these massive communities that are sitting still, they become targets for other groups. And so mobile groups like the Sioux, early on in the 1700s, it was groups like the Shoshone, would come and they would raid. And so these groups, the Mandan, Hadats, and Arikara, wind up consolidating together to protect themselves, which then makes them more susceptible to the next epidemic that comes. And so it kind of created this cycle.
But they lost a lot of people, right?
Oh, they lose lots of people. It's estimated that prior to contact, the Mandan probably numbered 10 to 13,000 people around the Heart River, which is where Bismarck is today. After the 1838 pandemic, 300 to 500 people.
Wow. And so it goes down that far. So then what is your research then to figure out how those 300 to 500 people
put their lives
on?
back together?
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm interested. Originally, I called it cultural persistence, but what I'm learning by working with indigenous scholars is they have their own term for it. And they don't want to be seen as victims, because while this is a traumatic story and a terrible story, the people who I work with today are the descendants of these people. And so for them, it's about what they call survivance. And they've managed to keep culture, they've managed to keep language and ritual practice and things like that. And so it's how does that happen? So that's what I study.
Well, I guess the next step is, why is that important to everyday humans now? Why should we care what happened 200 or 300 years ago to these people that got hit by these epidemics?
Because they're still here, their descendants are still here. And I think human diversity, I think globalization and development they're amazing things. You can go anywhere and you can get a Coke. You can go anywhere and you can get
McDonald's.
Nikes and McDonald's and stuff like that. And there's something to be said for being a global citizen. But as an anthropologist, human diversity is quite important, because the knowledge that local communities have, we don't know what's going to be important and what's not, especially for disasters. And so if you look at Polynesian groups, for example, they were quite resilient in the face of things like typhoons. And with globalization, you're seeing a decrease in people's resilience, and it's because we're losing that local knowledge base. And so studying past disasters, not just epidemics, because populations tend to act the same when they're under stress, but so modeling what local knowledge is, how people keep it, how they maintain those things, that's important for us if we're going to be resilient to increasing numbers of disasters that we have.
Can you apply that to the people in New Orleans or the people in Houston?
You can. There's a number of scholars that have done this, and so things that are really important are things, we see social networks are really important. So if you look at some place like the Ninth Ward with Katrina, they had a lot of within neighborhood connections, but they didn't have a lot of what we call bridging connections. So they didn't have, say, to the city officials that they needed, so they couldn't access things afterwards. But what we're finding is the bonding within the community is still really important. And so now there are things like intra-city group community gardens and things. And so like different churches will come together and and that gives that bridging capital. And then the community gardens maintain the bonding between. And so it's helping build more resilient neighborhoods for the next time they have a hurricane.
Very good. Kacy Hollenback, again, thanks for coming to the University of Louisville. Hope you enjoy your stay here in the lower plains, the Midwest. And that'll do it for this edition of UofL Today on 93.9 The Ville. Again, thanks for listening to UofL Today with Mark Hebert. And go Cards!